We were wrong. Terribly wrong. Robert McNamara's ghost still haunts the corridors of the Pentagon. His words about Vietnam echo today. The war with Iran began on February 28, 2026. According to the official Iranian press agency, over 500 American soldiers have been killed. US, a central command confirms a total of 6. The numbers, once again, do not add up. A lie of this magnitude is not propaganda. It is a containment strategy. It is a cover for a conventional military failure so absolute that the White House has been forced to activate a protocol that was supposed to have died with the Soviet Union. That protocol doesn't have a name. It has an asset, a piece of hardware you can watch on a radar screen. While the briefings insist that casualty curve is under control, numbers can be massaged. Moving a specific aircraft into a specific orbit is different. That's a decision. On March 4th, 2026, that decision shows up over the Persian Gulf. Public flight tracking feeds pick up a single distinctive airframe arriving from the west, then settling into a tight holding pattern offshore. It's not passing through. It's loitering, circling just outside the active war zone. The tail number belongs to a Boeing 707, designated the E-6B Mercury. It carries no bombs, has no stealth coating, and offers nothing to a conventional air battle. The crews call it something else. The Doomsday Plane. The E-6B is a flying node in America's nuclear command, control, and communications chain, built to relay emergency action messages to the nuclear triad after fixed command posts, including the Pentagon itself, have been hit. In peacetime, you can always stamp a sortie like this, training. But you do not park your airborne nuclear command post in a holding pattern over the Gulf in the middle of a shooting war if you believe your conventional forces have things contained. That orbit says one thing. This aircraft is waiting to take over if ground-based command and control fail. And that loops us back to the casualty numbers. When the gap between what frontline units are taking and what the public is told becomes persistent, it means the war is burning through resources faster than the story. You hide those losses to buy time, to avoid admitting that your carriers, bases, and regional headquarters are more vulnerable than promised. While the briefings talk about manageable costs, the real hedge is an E-6B quietly moving into position. Planners gaming the scenario where conventional deterrence collapses and only the nuclear backstop is left. In other words, that failure of conventional forces is now a live contingency. This is what that aircraft exists for. The moment when command nodes are destroyed, satellites are blinded, and the only way to reach the nuclear triad is from the air. When a platform built for that world is already on station during what officials still describe as a limited containable regional conflict, the nuclear contingency is no longer theoretical. A genuine containment posture doesn't need its doomsday communications node idling over the theatre. What other hidden escalations or leading indicators are you seeing that never make the evening news? Share your intelligence in the comments so we can map the real board, not the sanitized one they're briefing. Because this move, betting quietly on the nuclear backstop while telling the public the war is manageable, is not new. There is a playbook for this kind of failure, a blueprint for this spiral of denial and escalation. It was written in blood over the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the ghost of its author still walks the E-ring of the Pentagon. That author has a name, Robert McNamara. He wasn't a monster, he was a whiz kid. One of the brilliant data-driven minds brought in to run the Kennedy and Johnson administrations with ruthless efficiency. As Secretary of Defense, he became the architect of the Vietnam War, utterly convinced by flawed intelligence and his own models that it was a winnable conflict. He operated on metrics. His primary metric was the body count, a gruesome accounting that supposedly proved America was winning. Picture the scene. It's the mid-1960s. McNamara is at a podium in the Pentagon, a picture of absolute confidence. He points to charts, to graphs, the metrics all curve upwards. Kill ratios, enemy casualties. He's using numbers to justify escalating a small deployment of 16,000 advisors into a full-blown war machine. But inside his own mind, a different calculus is running. A colder truth. The inner monologue of a man trapped by his own system. The data is a lie. The body counts are meaningless distractions. We are not winning. But the president, the institution, it demands loyalty. It demands the appearance of victory. And so, he kept projecting success. He kept feeding the machine. The troop levels swelled past 100,000, past 300,000, cresting at over 500,000 American soldiers in the jungle. And he did this even after 1966, the year his own internal analysis concluded the war was unwinnable. He knew. Yet he continued to publicly support the escalation out of a misplaced sense of duty until the Tet Offensive in early 1968 shattered the public illusion of progress and finally led to his resignation. For 27 years, McNamara remained silent, a ghost haunted by his own calculations. Then, in 1995, he published his confession, a memoir titled In Retrospect. In it, he admitted his role in a national tragedy, a preventable catastrophe that ultimately cost 58,220 American lives. His confession stands as a permanent warning, a warning that is being ignored right now. Because while the Pentagon projects confidence, just as McNamara did, the rest of the world is running the numbers. And they're not just whispering about defeat, they're predicting it. In fact, a certain military analyst in Beijing, someone they call the Chinese Nostradamus, has already published his endgame calculations for this war in the Gulf. That analyst is Jiang Xueqin, a Chinese-Canadian Yale graduate nicknamed China's Nostradamus, after he called Trump's 2016 victory and this war. In Vietnam, it wasn't Hanoi that admitted the war was unwinnable. It was outside analysts and allies reading numbers. And Jiang stands in that line, watching numbers, not speeches, and calling failure before Washington does. His verdict reduces a superpower to a line item. He says, "The reality is, right now, it's a war of attrition between the United States and Iran, and Iranians have been preparing 20 years for this conflict." Strip away the Pentagon briefings. That's the balance sheet. His analysis ignores the speeches and treats it as a cost exchange equation. Iran has spent 20 years weaponizing $50,000 drones to force the US Navy to fire multi-million-dollar interceptors. One cheap drone, one expensive missile. They launch 10 more. You fire 10 more. Run that long and the curve turns lethal. Magazines empty, faster than they can be refilled. Commanders ration shots, and assets pull back to avoid being bled dry. The math is indifferent to flags. It says, this is an attrition war the United States cannot mathematically win. That is why Jiang concludes, the United States military is not designed to fight a 21st century war. A verdict that, from a Chinese-Canadian outsider with no vote in US elections, reads less like opinion and more like an intelligence brief. And the ledger he's reading is not staying in academia. Global markets, foreign intelligence services, and America's regional allies are all watching the same cost curves. Capital shifts away from exposed positions, threat assessments, quietly mark down US leverage. Allies whose cities and critical infrastructure sit on the front line of this losing equation start to doubt what a US security guarantee is worth and hedge Because when your survival depends on a patron whose cost curve is upside down, you move before the official admission of defeat. And the price for being on that front line is now being paid in full. The consequences of this strategic miscalculation are no longer abstract entries in a war game. They show up as grounded flights, closed terminals, and regional economies that can't clear a single day's transactions without disruption. In Dubai and Doha, main terminals that are normally rivers of humanity are now almost still. Departure boards stripped bare, aircraft idle at the gates, business channels cut from those empty halls to trading screens as Gulf equity indices sail off together. Financial press, think the front pages of the Financial Times, start running the same theme. Gulf partners are reconsidering US-linked deals. The chaos runs deep enough that the US State Department does something it almost never does. Issues an unprecedented advisory urging Americans to leave 14 separate countries across the region. For the Gulf allies, America claimed to be protecting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. This is not a distant proxy fight. It is their aviation, tourism, energy exports, and logistics chains that have seized up. Cabinets flip into crisis mode, reportedly ordering a review of energy and defense deals, infrastructure projects, and financial linkages with Washington, quietly asking lawyers how far force majeure clauses can be pushed before the alliance itself breaks. On the wall in secure briefing rooms, the Gulf map tells the story. Each American flag marks an air base, a port, an air corridor, a shared energy hub. One by one, those lights start to flicker as host governments delay clearances, limit operations, and hedge with other powers. For Washington, every dimmer light means fewer runways, narrower supply routes, and shrinking leverage. Behind embassy doors, the tone shifts. At the podium, statements stay bland. The partnership remains strong. Consultations are ongoing. In private cables and late-night calls, the message is stripped of diplomacy and sounds like panic. This war was imposed on us. It is destroying everything. We need you to leave before there is nothing left to protect. Markets watch that gap and start to price in higher risk premia on anything tied to long-term US presence in the Gulf. This is not random turbulence. It is the end state of a single systemic failure upstream, an intelligence assessment that inflated convenient threats, treated downside scenarios as impossible, and wrote dissenting data out of the brief. In the next chapter, we trace how that original sin turned into grounded planes, broken alliances, and losses on your screen. So how does a superpower with the most advanced intelligence apparatus in human history walk into a trap this obvious? The answer isn't on the battlefield, it sits in a single document. We step into the courtroom of strategic failure. On the prosecutor's table is Exhibit A, the joint CIA-Mossad assessment that served as this war's birth certificate. It was not one input among many. It was the central assumption around which the decapitation strategy and opening strikes were built. The document spoke in the language of high confidence. Code for all most certain. Kill Ayatollah Khamenei, it argued. And within days, a power vacuum would open, power blocks would split, and an uprising would welcome a different order. Clean, linear. Input, assassination. Output, according to the brief, rapid regime collapse. Now Exhibit B. Reality, February 28th, 2026. Khamenei and his family are dead. No uprising in Tehran. Streets fill with security forces, not protesters. The Iranian military's command structure doesn't shatter. It hardens. Within hours, operations rooms coordinate air, naval and missile units, and regional commanders who were supposed to be headless start executing pre-written war plans. Those pre-planned contingencies move from binder to battlefield. Missile batteries launch at US and Allied bases, cyber units hit energy and banking networks, and proxy militias move in lockstep. Washington built its strategy on the belief this system had one head and one brain. But Iran's security state was never a snake. It was a hydra. You don't decapitate a hydra. You cut off one node and the others route around the damage. On the map, as the central command node in Tehran goes dark, command and control hubs flare to life. Hardened sites in the interior, coastal nodes, regional headquarters near the borders, each with its own launch authority. The decapitation strategy failed because it misread the target's anatomy. This wasn't a minor miscalculation. It was the original sin. The entire campaign rested on an equation that was catastrophically wrong. Input, a single assassination. Expected output, an internal collapse that would keep American boots off Iranian soil and contain the cost. Actual output, a consolidated adversary, a regional war spilling across borders, billions in hardware and munitions already burned, allies dragged into the blast radius, and thousands of soldiers and civilians now living on a widening escalation ladder that pushes the world toward the nuclear brink. That's the most chilling part. You don't need leaks. The failure is obvious when you place Exhibit A beside Exhibit B. No uprising, no fracture, a war machine hitting back on multiple fronts. A rational actor would search for an off-ramp and cut losses. But sunk costs have their own gravity. Billions appropriated, carrier groups and ground forces in theatre. Leaders on record promising decisive results. After sanctions, covert pressure and surgical strikes have all failed to deliver. The conversation inside the White House narrows to the one move they swore they would never make. They are preparing to double down on the original sin by sending in ground troops. By this point, it wasn't hypothetical anymore. The plan circulating in the Situation Room was specific. It had a number: 5,000 American ground troops. Reports from inside the White House confirmed that President Trump was showing serious interest. After 20 years in Afghanistan, after spending $2 trillion to watch an army we built evaporate in less than a week, the institutions responsible weren't dismantled. They were promoted. The very playbook that failed there, the metrics, the slides, the faith that firepower can bend politics, is now being dusted off for Iran. That's not misfortune. It's a system willing to rerun a $2 trillion failure rather than write "we were wrong" in the margin. Then the telltale signs the professionals watch for began to surface. The 82nd Airborne Division, America's rapid reaction force. The unit you send when you need to break down a door tonight. Suddenly, it cancelled its major training exercises. This isn't a budget cut or a scheduling issue. In military logistics, that move is a classic, undeniable preparatory signal for imminent deployment. In Washington, under the cold glow of screens, they stared at maps. Lives reduced to icons. Blue for us, red for them. Arrows tracing advances across terrain they'd never walk. A staffer circled 5,000 as if it were just another budget line. They were trapped by their own narrative. After selling Iran's behavior and their flawless intelligence to the public, admitting the original red was wrong would shatter their credibility. The only way to keep the story intact was to go further in. In Iran, the response looked nothing like those conference rooms. A commander stood in dusty fatigues inside a concrete-walled base, flanked by men who had drilled for years for the day Americans might cross their border.
No teleprompter, no ambient hum of projectors. He heard Washington's threats and answered as if speaking straight to the soldiers on the other end. Let your soldiers come. We have been preparing for this for decades. Come. The confidence came from time and terrain, not from a script. This is the point of no return, the moment the machinery locks. Once you cancel exercises, move rapid reaction units forward, and issue public threats, backing down without escalation becomes politically impossible. The strategic trap has been sprung, but the politicians in Washington and the generals in Iran aren't the only ones at risk. This miscalculation is about to send a bill to a third, unlisted party. Every war built on a lie is ultimately paid for not in the currency of strategy, but in the hard currency of your retirement account. The first withdrawal is about to be made. That withdrawal is not a single transaction. It is a quiet, sustained drain on your wealth, executed through a mechanism history has documented with brutal clarity: war-fueled inflation. Under the surface, two mechanisms are doing the damage: high burn rate war spending and an energy shock hitting the same balance sheet at the same time. First, the direct cost. This war is burning through more than $1 billion a day. Another $50 billion in supplemental funding is already being lined up just to replace depleted munitions. With the budget already deep in the red, that tab is effectively being stapled onto the national debt. Second, the energy shock. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point for 20% of global oil, has already pushed Brent crude more than 25% higher. The IMF estimates that alone could add about 0.4 of a percentage point to global inflation. On the ground, that shows up as roughly 40 cents more per gallon at the pump in a matter of weeks. Put deficit-funded war spending on top of a supply-side energy crunch and you have an engine for sustained inflation. In that environment, the real value of your retirement account first flatlines, then quietly slips backward as prices refuse to stop climbing. This is not a forecast, it is a historical echo. A working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, number 271Y5, showed how Vietnam's largely deficit-financed war, roughly $1.3 trillion in today's terms, fed inflation that erased between 1/3 and 1/2 of the value of fixed income assets. Different era, different monetary regime, but the core mechanism is the same. Government finances an open-ended war with debt. Inflation does the cleanup, and savers pay the bill. Ignore that pattern, and the math will repeat on your balance sheet. Stop. Before I show you how to position for this, understand one thing. The institutions want you to be paralyzed by this data. They are counting on it. But this period of denial, it's not just a risk, it is a closing window of opportunity for those who can see the real math. While the market and the media stay fixated on official talking points, you can watch 3 indicators instead. Simple, hard-to-spin measures of physical flows and contracts. First, track oil tanker traffic through the Gulf using public shipping data. If departures and arrivals through Hormuz drop and stay low, that signals sustained supply disruption and a higher floor under energy prices and inflation risk. Second, listen to quarterly earnings calls from major defense contractors like Raytheon and Lockheed. When management talks about swelling backlogs and multi-year replenishment contracts tied to this conflict, that is your forward guidance that wartime spending and the deficit pressure that comes with it is being normalized, not wound down. Third, pay attention to credible leaks from congressional staffers about the size of the one-time supplemental military budget. If those numbers keep coming in higher than the public trial balloons, You are seeing the real cost curve drift upward, and with it the odds that policymakers quietly choose inflation over visible austerity. Together, those three signals show you whether this conflict is being contained or allowed to metastasize into a long inflationary drain. Once you see those signals turn, you are not guessing. You have a rationale to move. That might mean gradually tilting more of your portfolio toward inflation-hedged assets, commodities, energy exposure, and yes, gold. While the official story still promises that everything is temporary. This is not day trading headlines. It is aligning your capital with the underlying reality, while most investors remain anchored to the narrative. Because in the end, this is about more than one retirement account. A system that repeatedly finances strategic failure by stealth taxing its own savers is a system burning through trust, not just dollars. That erosion of trust is the real reckoning we are heading toward. And it will arrive whether or not the institutions ever choose to admit what went wrong. So you align your capital with reality. You insulate yourself while others still buy the short, low-cost war they were promised. You step out of the denial loop that lets their miscalculation bleed into your retirement and grocery bill. After flawed intelligence, doomed escalations, and the market shock that shows up as inflation, one cold truth remains. The system that creates these wars insulates the decision makers from the consequences. They misjudge, escalate, and walk away rewarded while the damage compounds elsewhere. Picture them in secure rooms while soldiers eat dust abroad, families watch silent phones, and citizens see pump prices jump and portfolios bleed. The people paying that cost are not the people making the decision. They never are. They never are. If you believe in exposing the truth behind the numbers, subscribe and share this analysis. The cost of denial is too high to pay again.